Well, for a long time, our Department of Teacher Education, Special Education, Curriculum and Instruction has had a focus on inquiry, and as part of that, on action research. So Jerry was very much at the very beginnings of creating this emphasis on inquiry, including the courses we offer on the topic of inquiry, which include the action research studies that the students perform. So what I noticed as I took on an increasing role in the inquiry courses and actually took on teaching them a few years ago, uh, was that there weren't any textbooks yet or any kind of book other than a textbook that really focused on action research specific to special education. So while there were some in the area of inclusion, there was nothing in special ed. So I went to Jerry and asked him what he thought about that and if he might be interested in writing a book together. I had tremendous regard for Jerry, a very dear colleague who everyone respected so much. And the funny thing is, while we were trying to market the book and convince people that action research was as relevant to special ed as to general ed, Jerry wrote an entirely different book on the democratizing and its relationship to action research. So then we identified a publisher and set forth. And of course, as everyone here knows, on our campus, Jerry passed away during the writing of this book, which was very, very sad. Well, first of all, action research is a form of qualitative research. It is still disciplined, what Schulman would call disciplined inquiry. It is systematic, like all good research should be. What distinguishes action research, I think, from other types of research is that it's really largely a problem-solving kind of approach to research. And it is deeply respectful of complex problems that exist in very complicated settings like classrooms, settings that have nested, complex characteristics to them. So action research is a problem-solving approach, and it is also recursive in nature. So often when we talk about action research, we talk about multiple cycles of reflection and action, and my hands want to create a spiral because often when you look at a textbook, it's drawn like a spiral to depict also its recursive nature. So revisiting previous ideas, revisiting the literature, having conversations, perhaps picking up on actions you took previously, shaping them in a new way to effectively solve a complex problem. Well, first of all, I might say that we use the term action research as opposed to teacher research very deliberately because we wanted to reflect an understanding that action research in special ed goes far beyond the collaboration of teachers, and that parents of children with disabilities are very important to that process, and therapists, psychologists, and others who may not be licensed teachers. But specifically in terms of education, the importance of action research lies in the fact that it supports teachers to own the problems they face in their classroom. And so special educators may be in a variety of contexts addressing complex problems, some of which they might be able to solve on their own, some of which require collaboration. So I think it lies in the whole idea of the importance of preparing teachers in special education to be action research is so that they recognize problems, take responsibility for them, and have a method to approach the problem, a problem-solving method, we could say, that involves this repeated cycles then of action and reflection. Participatory action research is when individuals in the area of special ed, participatory action research means that individuals with disabilities not only join researchers without disabilities in the study of some authentic issue, but they define the topic of research. So that's what's important. So instead of coming from the outside and telling people with disabilities what ought to be important to them, they tell us what's important to them. And where the invitation comes from, it could come from the researchers without disabilities, it could come from the disability community. But it's about the individuals with disabilities. And it's a little trickier when we're talking about children, of course. We don't have a lot of evidence, a lot of examples of participatory action research with children. But with adults with disabilities, it's about self-definition, and it's about sharing of power. And then when we talk about emancipatory research, it takes it to an entirely different level, I think, whether you regard that as a subset of participatory research, participatory action research, or its own type of action research. Because in that case, we're talking about really the community of individuals with disabilities having the power. So not just a sharing of power, but what I would call a shift in power, including access to financial resources that support research. When I think about inquiry and I think about its connection to research, I also think about the importance of teachers becoming reflective practitioners. So in our department, in fact this year, we're going to be having a year-long conversation about how is inquiry more than inquiry within a course, and what do we do as a faculty then to address inquiry in a way that a teacher views inquiry as a way of being in the classroom, a way of teaching. So inquiry as stance is often a phrase you hear in teacher education, including special education. And that means that you understand that every day and in every moment of teaching, you are engaging in a form of inquiry. And action research then is one way of engaging in inquiry. So reflection about what's happening in your classroom and about your teaching and about student learning is connected to action research, and action research is connected to a broader concept of inquiry. And what we really want to generate are teachers who have developed inquiry as stance. We have an overarching focus on social justice within our Department of Teacher Education, Special Education, Curriculum, and Instruction. And when we say social justice, what we mean is that our goal is to improve life opportunities, and that is for children, because we are a teacher program, teacher education program. So we have 5 themes within our department, and one of those themes is around constructing knowledge, which has an obvious connection to the conduct of action research and to engaging in inquiry more broadly. And we also have a focus on collaboration. So some of our students are learning to engage in action research that is somewhat more collaborative, particularly if they did a classroom action research study at the undergrad level and they did another study as a graduate student in a 5th-year program, they might then focus more on a collaborative kind of question. So inquiry, engaging in inquiry, is also another theme within our department. Diversity is yet another theme. And often the problems that we engage in considering in classroom settings involve a variety of diversity challenges for us, such as English language learners, perhaps questionable identification of disability of children who are recent immigrants, and so forth. So all of these themes that the faculty in our department have agreed upon and that drive our work are also connected to how we engage in inquiry in our own research and how we nurture the engagement in inquiry by our students. Right? I'd be happy to describe the structure of the book. So the book starts out with a historical chapter, and really a chapter that focuses on the grounding principles, which Jerry wrote. And Jerry was very, very knowledgeable about all the historical pieces. So he traces the evolution of action research in education and then special education by starting outside the field of education. So talking about major characters in this evolution, such as Collier, whose work was driven by his concerns about how the U.S. government and U.S. citizens treated the Native Americans in our country, followed by people like Lewin, who focused on issues of racism in the United States, and then evolving into what Jerry talked about as more the modern action research, or what some people call in the field of education teacher researcher movement, and major characters including our Marilyn Cochran Smith and her contributions, and her colleague Little. So that's the first chapter. In the second chapter, there's several goals that are accomplished. One is to give an orientation to types of action research, and in that chapter I use Hendrick's schema, where the 4 types of action research are depicted as classroom action research, collaborative action research, and then moves into critical action research and participatory action research. So when we think of teacher research, what we're really talking about most often would be the first 2 types within Hendrick's schema. And that's one reason why in special ed and in our book we wanted to use the term action research, as well as to keep the action in the research, so to speak, quite literally. And then we moved into, within that chapter, I talk about the application of those 4 types of action research to one social justice issue, that of disproportionate representation of children with various characteristics in special education, which can include misidentification or wrongful identification of a disability, and how a classroom teacher at the very beginning of her career might apply classroom action research to that problem, but how we might bring in critical members of the community to take a different look at the question. So how to apply the 4 types of action research to one major issue of social justice faced by children with and without disabilities. And then in the middle of those 2 sections is an illustrative review of some of the action research studies that have been conducted already, and only those that appeared in peer-reviewed journals. And then the book goes on to provide a chapter of how to do research, in the hopes that would be a guide to students that might be taking an undergraduate or master's level course in action research. And then there's a chapter on how the concepts of reflection and action research and inquiry all fit together in a broader schema of thinking about an entire program. So that chapter 4, is really more focused on the faculty in a university program, in general ed or special ed perhaps. And then it was a lot of fun to include student writings. So we have 4 chapters that are actual action research studies that were conducted by master's students in our department. Each of those studies is on children who are struggling in some way in the classroom, identified or not yet identified with special needs. And these papers each earned distinction, which is only given to no more than 10% of students who conduct those studies every semester. And then in the final chapter, I do a short, it's really called an afterword, where I reflect on the status of action research in special ed and what's missing, some concerns I had when I was reviewing the action research studies in special education. Well, the first thing that pops into mind was one of my primary concerns, and that was that I could see confusion between phases of research and cycles of action and reflection, and that bothered me. So some people were straying away from multiple cycles of action and reflection, which is really at the very foundation of what action research is. It's essential to conducting action research. And they were confusing that with phases of research like collecting literature, interviewing people as part of information gathering. So confusion over phases of research versus really taking cycles of reflection and action to try new things to solve a problem. And then, of course, systematic measurement of the effect of the actions. So I was also really, really surprised that there were not more published studies involving family members, given that in special education, family members play such a remarkable role, both in assessment, in developing the individualized education plan, and in the ways that we coordinate between school and home on our interventions. But there was really very little there. There was some body of research in inclusion, but not so much on community inclusion. So in that last chapter, I tried to talk about some of the missing elements, as well as this confusion that I feel is important to clarify around multiple cycles of reflection and action. I'm not at a point where I'm thinking of another book based on the missing information yet, but I have thought about the power of perhaps bringing people together in an action research community in a new way. I've noticed that some of our graduates tend to email, at least me, my graduates in the severe disabilities area, often email in at about 3-4 years post-graduation, and they're not ready yet for doctoral study, or maybe that's not where they're headed, but they want something new, and I have been very surprised. It's been uncanny how many of them have referenced this old action research study they did several years earlier and wanting to know if we have some sort of community of action researchers or discussion groups. And the Europeans, I think, have done more than we have in terms of creating these communities of practicing teachers and creating websites that document this kind of work. So that's really as far as my thinking's gone about follow-up. The book just came out in July. Yes, we really wrote this book for both students and the faculty. The only thing that really changed from the initial conceptualization of the book was the fact that we added that chapter, the how-to chapter, because it seemed kind of funny to have a book about action research but not walk someone through the steps of it. So we also envision it not only for pre-service, but thinking about these in-service groups of teachers who might be forming on their own. One of our doctoral students actually has such a group right now that's meeting regularly. So sometimes teachers do this all by themselves without the support of a university researcher, and so that drove us to add this chapter about the conduct of action research and how do you conduct action research in a way that is disciplined and systematic and credible. I think in conclusion, I would say that I was very grateful to have an opportunity to work with my dear colleague and friend Jerry Pine. It was horrible to lose him partway through the book, but the message came from me, even in the last week he was alive through Maryland, that I had to finish it. So it was a great honor to work with him, and it was wonderful to take a deeper, more scholarly examination of something we'd both been teaching for a while.